In a stunning twist in the ongoing geopolitical drama between Russia and Ukraine, intelligence sources and diplomatic insiders revealed that an alleged plan to detain Russian President Vladimir Putin during an upcoming international summit has been foiled. The development comes just as Kyiv signals its willingness to consider a ceasefire agreement with Moscow, marking a potential turning point in a conflict that has defined global politics for more than 3 years. A failed plan and a growing mystery. According to multiple European diplomatic sources, Western officials had discussed, in private circles, the theoretical possibility of invoking international legal mechanisms to arrest President Putin if he were to attend certain global forums outside Russia. The International Criminal Court (ICC) warrant issued against him earlier had made such discussions inevitable. However, Russian security agencies reportedly uncovered traces of a coordinated attempt to make the arrest operation feasible through cooperation between certain European and intelligence partners. The Kremlin immediately moved to strengthen the president's security protocol and to restrict his physical presence at foreign events deemed high risk. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova described the discussions as a desperate and reckless fantasy that exposed the West's political immaturity. She emphasized that any attempt to detain the Russian leader would be treated as an act of war. Within hours, Russian media outlets echoed a unified narrative. The so-called plan to arrest Putin had collapsed under its own unrealistic ambition. Meanwhile, Western analysts denied that such an operation ever existed in practical form, framing the leak as part of a Russian counterintelligence effort to justify tighter internal control and boost the president's image as a besieged yet untouchable leader. A new tone from Kyiv. While this diplomatic storm unfolded, Ukraine's leadership appeared to be recalibrating its rhetoric. For months, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his administration had maintained that negotiations with Russia were impossible until full territorial integrity was restored. However, in a televised address this week, Zelensky used a noticeably softer tone, speaking of the need for practical solutions that lead to sustainable peace. This subtle shift, amplified by several Ukrainian officials in subsequent interviews, has led analysts to speculate that Kyiv might be preparing its public for a new phase of diplomacy. The country's military situation, though still resilient, has become increasingly difficult amid ammunition shortages, fading Western enthusiasm, and the devastating toll of a prolonged war. International observers see the Ukrainian president's remarks as the first serious indication that Kyiv may be open to discussing a truce, possibly under the mediation of Turkey, China, or even neutral European nations. A source close to Ukraine's foreign ministry suggested that exploratory talks were already taking place through backchannels, focusing on humanitarian corridors, prisoner exchanges, and the stabilization of front lines. Moscow's reaction. Cautious optimism. The Kremlin's response to Kyiv's change in tone was uncharacteristically restrained. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press secretary, said that Russia has never closed the door to negotiations, but emphasized that any talks must recognize the new territorial realities. This statement, widely interpreted as a reference to Russia's control over annexed regions, highlights the difficult road ahead for any peace process. Russian state media, however, portrayed Ukraine's position as a sign of defeat. Television anchors and political commentators declared that the special military operation was nearing its final stage, with Western support crumbling, and Kyiv seeking a face-saving exit. The narrative aims to project strength and inevitability, reinforcing domestic morale amid growing fatigue from sanctions and war costs. At the same time, independent analysts inside Russia note that Moscow, too, has incentives to explore a ceasefire. The war has strained the Russian economy, limited foreign investment, and isolated the country diplomatically. A temporary truce could allow the Kremlin to stabilize the situation without appearing to retreat, while simultaneously testing Western unity and Ukraine's long-term resilience. The ICC warrant and the politics of symbolism. The alleged plan to arrest Putin has reignited debate about the ICC's role and credibility. When the warrant was first issued in 2023, it was hailed by human rights groups as a moral victory for accountability. But critics pointed out that the court has little enforcement power, particularly against leaders of major powers who control nuclear arsenals. The renewed attention on the warrant underscores the limits of international law in the face of geopolitical realities. There's a difference between moral legitimacy and operational capability, said Dr. Julia Reinhardt, a legal scholar at the University of Geneva. No Western state would realistically risk open conflict with Russia by physically attempting to arrest its sitting president. Nevertheless, the symbolism of the warrant has continued to shape the international conversation. It isolates Putin from certain diplomatic circles while giving Ukraine and its allies a moral high ground. Yet, the failure of any tangible enforcement also highlights the fragility of the post-World War II legal order that once sought to hold all leaders accountable, regardless of power. Washington and Brussels. Divided calculations. In Washington, reactions to Ukraine's potential readiness for peace have been mixed. Some U.S. officials, particularly in the Pentagon, privately acknowledge that the conflict has reached a strategic stalemate. With global crises multiplying and domestic politics intensifying ahead of the 2026 U.S. elections, there is little appetite for another prolonged foreign commitment. However, key voices within the State Department and Congress remain wary of any settlement that could reward Russia's aggression. A premature ceasefire would only embolden Moscow and betray the sacrifices Ukrainians have made, one senior diplomat told The Washington Post. Across the Atlantic, European capitals appear equally divided. Poland and the Baltic states have warned against trusting Russia, citing centuries of historical experience. In contrast, France and Germany are quietly exploring diplomatic initiatives that could lay the groundwork for a gradual de-escalation. The battlefield reality. Despite talk of peace, the situation on the ground remains volatile. The front lines stretching across Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson continue to witness daily exchanges of artillery fire and drone strikes. Neither side has achieved decisive breakthroughs in months, but both endure heavy losses. Ukrainian soldiers, exhausted yet defiant, speak of war without end. Russian troops, bolstered by mobilization waves and private contractors, maintain control over strategic areas but face morale challenges and logistical constraints. Military experts agree that both sides are approaching the limits of sustainable warfare. This is now a war of attrition that neither can win outright, said British analyst Michael Clark. That's why political solutions are once again on the table. The global stakes. Beyond Eastern Europe, the implications of these developments are vast. The outcome of the Russia-Ukraine conflict will shape the architecture of global power for decades. China is watching closely, balancing its support for Moscow with its economic interests in Europe. The Middle East, meanwhile, remains a theater of shifting alliances, where Russia's presence in Syria and its growing ties with Iran add another layer of complexity. For the global South, from Africa to Latin America, the war has become a lesson in the fragility of Western-led institutions. Many nations view the crisis not as a moral struggle but as a competition between empires. The talk of a truce, therefore, resonates differently, as an opportunity for multipolar diplomacy rather than a simple peace between two warring neighbors. Domestic pressure on both sides. Inside Ukraine, public sentiment remains fiercely patriotic but increasingly weary. Families of soldiers demand clarity about the war's long-term objectives. Inflation, energy shortages, and mass displacement have created a deep social burden. Zelensky, once hailed as a heroic wartime leader, now faces growing pressure to balance resistance with realism. In Russia, the situation is equally complex. The Kremlin continues to project confidence, but economic sanctions and mobilization fatigue are taking their toll. Ordinary citizens grapple with rising prices, limited travel options, and uncertainty about the future. A ceasefire could offer temporary relief and a chance for the government to redirect resources toward domestic priorities. The road ahead, whether this moment marks the beginning of genuine peace or merely a pause in hostilities, remains unclear. Diplomatic sources suggest that preliminary discussions could take months before any formal negotiations occur. The success of such talks will depend not only on Moscow and Kyiv but also on the willingness of Western powers to coordinate a coherent strategy. If Ukraine proceeds with a truce, it will need security guarantees and economic reconstruction plans. For Russia, the challenge will be to claim political victory without provoking further sanctions or internal dissent. For the rest of the world, a ceasefire would provide a brief respite, but the deeper ideological divide between East and West is unlikely to disappear. Conclusion. A fragile moment in history. The collapse of the alleged plan to arrest Putin and Ukraine's cautious readiness for dialogue represent two sides of the same geopolitical coin. On one side lies the futility of punitive symbolism, on the other, the sobering recognition that endless war offers no winners. As the world watches, both leaders, Putin and Zelensky, stand at a crossroads. One has built his legacy on defiance, the other on courage. Both now face the ultimate test of leadership, the ability to end a war that has reshaped their nations and the world. In this fragile moment, hope flickers like a candle in the storm, fragile, uncertain, but undeniably present. The next few months will determine whether that light fades into renewed conflict or grows into the dawn of a long-awaited peace.